The Knights of the Old Republic remake has been surrounded by mystery since its announcement. Mystery is basically the nice way to say that from what little we've heard about its development, things haven't exactly gone smoothly. The game was originally being developed by Aspyr Media, which was basically the bottom rung in a corporate ladder, putting it directly under Saber Interactive, which was itself under the umbrella of Embracer Group. You're probably aware about a lot of the issues going on with Knights of the Old Republic, but what you might not know is how this relates to the issues with other Star Wars media. But first, let's stick with the KotOR remake for a minute. Aspyr has had many of its own struggles in creating Star Wars media, having also been responsible for multiple console ports of classic Star Wars games. This included a Knights of the Old Republic port, the Battlefront Classic Collection, and the Knights of the Old Republic 2 port. The latter is probably among their more controversial works, given how their promise to include the restored content mod in some fashion led to a massive lawsuit, which in turn has become one of the few sources of information we actually have about the KotOR remake. Even aside from the restored content mod, it was plagued with other issues in being able to actually finish the game. For much of Aspyr's history, they were largely just a studio doing these kinds of ports though. But soon after, Embracer acquired the studio in 2021, placing them under Saber, which they had acquired the year before, it was announced that they would be the full-on developers of the Knights of the Old Republic remake. We know that many studios had actually pitched a similar project, but it's Aspyr which was granted the green light from Disney to go ahead with it. At the time, when we talked about it on TapCaf Transmissions, my podcast with Eckhart's Ladder, he said it was a really surprising move to have a company which usually just worked on ports to develop the game, but I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt and said it might come with greater resources behind the project. This was very wrong of me to do. Embracer would never do that, given that in 2022, it was announced that the remake had been moved to Saber directly, although the initial news about this was a lot more vague than that. In 2024, Saber Interactive was then sold off to another new investment firm, Beacon Interactive, which was part of a broader restructuring of Embracer in that year. And we have since learned that KotOR has survived in their hands. It's still technically being developed, but we'll see if it actually fares any better there. Basically, what you can see throughout the industry is that Embracer will buy up companies, essentially run them into the ground, and then end up shutting them down or selling them off. This isn't a new phenomenon, and it's not unique to Embracer, nor am I even necessarily going to say that the companies going under are always a result of this kind of buyout, though I certainly think that it doesn't make them more resilient. What is categorically true, though, is that these always come with the companies being structured in such a way that the only thing which matters is the amount of money coming out of them. The value they're creating for private equity and stakeholders is all that really gets considered, certainly not employee welfare. But a company may get acquired or sold because they were already having financial troubles. These companies then also get exposed to volatility from the parent group and any failed investments that happen there. And this is something that we see within Embracer, which has directly impacted Star Wars media, bringing us to the real point of this video. If you're a longtime viewer of the channel, you'll know I'm a big fan of the tabletop RPG content produced under the Star Wars IP. Not just because I enjoy playing them, which I don't get to do as often as I'd like, but because they're a big source for the background lore of the universe. Almost all of my lore videos involve some kind of information that came from an RPG supplement at some point in its life. The older West End games, and Wizards of the Coast tabletop RPGs in particular, were pretty foundational in a lot of Star Wars lore. And then when a third company, Fantasy Flight Games, got the license for Star Wars tabletop content, they used this to produce Edge of the Empire, Age of Rebellion, and Force and Destiny with their Genesis dice system, a system which I really enjoy. But on top of that, there are dozens of source books which flesh out even more lore, including some parts of the universe that are otherwise fairly underexplored. These include the unknown regions, HUD space, and the buttons to like this video and subscribe for more. FFG also produced the X-Wing, Armada, and Legion tabletop games. In 2014, Fantasy Flight was merged with the French game publisher Asmodee. This is partially noteworthy because Asmodee had been bought up by a private equity firm called Eurazeo earlier that year, which is what prompted Asmodee to start expanding by buying even more companies like FFG. RPG supplements in the miniature games continued to be released up through 2019 to 2020, at which point Asmodee announced they would be splitting up these types of content to new companies. FFG would continue to work on their usual board games, but miniature games like X-Wing, Armada, and Legion would move over to the new Atomic Mass games, while the Genesis system and connected tabletop RPG content would be moving to Edge Entertainment, which renamed to Edge Studios in 2023. But 2021 is also when Asmodee itself was acquired by Embracer Group, which essentially turned into a ticking time bomb for Star Wars content and board games in general for reasons we'll get to in a minute. Star Wars Legion, a ground combat miniature game, continued to be supported in much the same way under Atomic Mass. There's still new content coming out, and it was even joined by a second ground-based miniature game, Shatterpoint. The space combat games Armada and X-Wing were less lucky. Citing things like manufacturing issues and production costs, both were closed down in 2024. Miniature games as a whole, though, have fared better than tabletop RPGs have for Star Wars. I'm going to show a full list of everything on screen right now, which has been released by Edge since they took over the tabletop Star Wars content. Yeah. So chances of this situation ever improving under Asmodee seem to get even worse in 2024, when it was announced that Embracer would be split into several parts, and I'll link the Games Radar article about this. But Embracer said, quote, "Following a careful and thorough review is the assessment of the board of directors that the current group structure does not create optimal conditions for future value creation, both for Embracer Group's shareholders and other stakeholders," end quote. So what had actually happened was that Embracer had been relying on a $2 billion deal with Savvy, which is the games branch of the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund, to help offset what Dicebreaker called $1.4 billion in debt. So when this $2 billion didn't materialize, the strategy of buy everything turned out to be not as feasible for growing stock prices or for repaying those investments. So at this point, I'm not really sure what a lot of those companies got out of being bought by Embracer. Except for maybe some layoffs, because there are a lot of layoffs, I have to give that to them. But Asmodee was one of the parts which was spun off of Embracer, and as part of Embracer's recovery, that included Asmodee as this new separate entity being spun off with over $920 million in debt, an absolutely massive portion of the debt held by Embracer as a whole, because Asmodee had been one of the better performing parts of the company. So, Asmodee had been doing all right with their releases, they had decent sales. I'm not going to pretend the company didn't have other issues, but this $920 million in debt was specifically put with them because they were the better performing part of the company. The game industry, whether you mean the video game industry or the tabletop game industry, is already a tough place to be, but it's probably not exaggerating to say that this extra nearly $1 billion in debt is not helpful or a great sign for the future of companies under Asmodee, or previously under Embracer. Asmodee is a huge chunk of the industry as it is, so them being in such a precarious position, pretty much as a direct result of them becoming such a big part of the industry in the first place, could have massive negative consequences, even beyond me just not getting a source book about the Chiss ascendancy. And while we're talking about the impact of Embracer on buying these companies making Star Wars content, one of the other companies that was bought by Embracer in 2021 was Dark Horse. Dark Horse is, of course, one of the major names in comic publishing alongside Marvel, and they're responsible for a lot of the Star Wars comics that come out. It was basically just announced that the Dark Horse founder and CEO, Mike Richardson, was leaving the company now, and Embracer had replaced him with Jay Comas, who is from Middle-earth Enterprises, also within Embracer. All of this, though, is at least a transformative step for value creation, so that's great, even though it may be responsible for us not being allowed to have nice things. Not to mention, again, the hundreds of layoffs under Embracer in the last few years. Yet another industry-wide issue. Thanks for watching, though. I hope you've enjoyed whatever this was, and I hope to see you next time. Thanks as well to Marmar for editing this video.